For 40 years, one of California's most prolific criminals remained invisible. Dozens of crime scenes, hundreds of investigators, mountains of evidence, but no name. Then, in 2018, a revolutionary technique borrowed from family history websites did what 4 decades of traditional detective work could not. The breakthrough would change criminal investigations forever. But to understand that breakthrough, we need to go back to where it all began. In the late 1970s, a phantom terrorized California communities. Investigators called him the East Area Rapist. Later, he became known as the Golden State Killer. Between 1976 and 1986, he committed at least 13 murders, 50 rapes, and over 100 burglaries across the state. Then, suddenly, he vanished. What made this case extraordinary was the evidence left behind. At multiple crime scenes, investigators recovered biological samples, DNA evidence, the genetic fingerprint of the perpetrator, preserved and cataloged with meticulous care. In the 1980s, they had the evidence, but they didn't yet have the technology to read it. By the 1990s, DNA profiling had revolutionized forensics. Investigators finally processed the Golden State Killer's biological samples and generated a complete DNA profile. They uploaded it to CODIS, the FBI's criminal DNA database, hoping for a match with a known offender. They waited and waited. No match ever appeared. The problem was simple, but insurmountable. CODIS only contains DNA profiles from convicted criminals and arrestees. If the Golden State Killer had never been arrested, or if his crimes predated DNA collection laws, his profile wouldn't be in the system. Investigators had his genetic identity locked in a database, but no key to unlock the name attached to it. Task forces formed and disbanded. Thousands of tips led nowhere. Suspects were investigated and eliminated. Original investigators retired, some passing away before seeing justice. Victims' families aged, their hope fading with each passing year. The case remained open, but most believed it would never be solved. But while the investigation stalled, something remarkable was happening in another corner of the world. Millions of people were becoming amateur genealogists, uploading their DNA to websites like Ancestry and GEDmatch. They wanted to find distant cousins, trace their heritage, build their family trees. What they didn't realize was that they were creating something else entirely, a map of human connection. One investigator was watching this genealogy revolution with particular interest. In 2017, Paul Holes was approaching retirement. He'd spent decades on the Golden State Killer case, and the weight of those unsolved crimes haunted him. He knew the DNA evidence was solid. He knew the perpetrator's genetic code by heart. There had to be another way to use it. Holes learned about a case in Utah where an investigator had used a public genealogy database to identify a deceased John Doe. Not by finding the person directly, but by finding their relatives. It was an investigative technique that had never been used in a violent crime case. Holes realized the implications immediately. If it worked for a John Doe, could it work for a killer? Holes contacted a genetic genealogist named Barbara Rae-Venter. She was a scientist who helped adoptees find their birth families using DNA and genealogy. When Holes explained the case, Rae-Venter understood the challenge immediately. They weren't looking for the Golden State Killer's DNA in a database. They were looking for his family. The plan was audacious. Use the killer's own DNA against him, not by finding him directly, but by finding his relatives in public genealogy databases. Then trace those family connections backward through time and forward through generations. Somewhere in that vast digital network of family trees and genetic data, the answer was waiting to be found. To understand what happened next, you need to understand how genetic genealogy works. Think of your DNA as a book written by all your ancestors. Half the pages come from your mother, half from your father, a quarter from each grandparent, an eighth from each great-grandparent. The further back you go, the smaller the contribution, but traces remain. When two people share DNA, it means they share ancestors. First cousins share about 12.5% of their DNA because they share grandparents. Second cousins share about 3% because they share great-grandparents. Third cousins might share less than 1%, but it's still detectable with modern testing. Genetic genealogy works backwards from this principle. If you upload DNA to a genealogy database and find matches, you can build family trees for each match. Eventually, those trees connect at common ancestors. And if those matches are relatives of an unknown person, you can identify that person by mapping the family tree forward from those ancestors. In December 2017, investigators uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database. They created an account under a pseudonym and waited. Within hours, the database returned results. The DNA matched with over a dozen distant relatives. Barbara Rae-Venter began the painstaking work. She examined each DNA match, determining the degree of relationship based on shared genetic material. Then, she built family trees for each match using public records, census data, birth certificates, and obituaries. Each tree reached back through generations, searching for the common ancestors where the branches connected. The closest match was a third cousin. That meant the Golden State Killer and this match shared a set of great-great-grandparents, likely born in the 1800s. Rae-Venter had to build a family tree forward from those ancestors, mapping every descendant across 5 generations. It was genealogical detective work on an unprecedented scale. For weeks, Rae-Venter worked around the clock. She identified multiple branches of the family tree, each representing a potential line to the perpetrator. As she narrowed the possibilities, she provided names to investigators. They began cross-referencing candidates against known facts about the case: age, location during the crimes, physical description, criminal history. But geographical analysis narrowed the field dramatically. The crimes occurred exclusively in Northern California. Any descendants living outside this region during the 1970s and 80s could be eliminated. Branch by branch, the family tree contracted from thousands of possibilities to a manageable number. One name emerged that matched every parameter: Joseph James DeAngelo. Born in 1945, lived in Northern California during the crime spree, and remarkably, he had been a police officer during the 1970s. A fact that explained his ability to evade capture and understand investigative techniques. But genetic genealogy alone isn't enough for an arrest. Investigators needed definitive proof. They began surveillance of DeAngelo, watching his home in the Sacramento suburb of Citrus Heights. They needed his DNA to compare directly with the crime scene evidence, and they needed to obtain it legally. In April 2018, detectives followed DeAngelo to a hobby store. After he left, they recovered items he had touched and discarded. The objects were rushed to the lab for DNA extraction. Scientists processed the samples using the same PCR amplification and sequencing techniques that had analyzed the original crime scene evidence decades earlier. The comparison was unequivocal. Forensic scientists examined 13 genetic markers. They calculated statistical probabilities. The results were definitive. The probability of error? 1 in 60 trillion. For context, there are fewer than 8 billion people on Earth. The statistical certainty was absolute. After 40 years, science had delivered what seemed impossible: a name. Genetic genealogy had succeeded where traditional databases failed because it didn't require the perpetrator's DNA to already be in a system. It only required distant relatives who had voluntarily shared their genetic information. People searching innocently for their ancestry had unknowingly created a web that could trace anyone connected to them. The implications were staggering. What made this breakthrough revolutionary was its logic. If you share DNA with someone, you must share ancestors. If you can identify those ancestors and map their descendants, you can identify anyone in that family tree. It was genealogy meeting forensic science, and it had just solved one of America's most notorious cold cases. With the DNA match confirmed, investigators moved quickly. On April 24, 2018, police arrested Joseph James DeAngelo at his home. He was 72 years old, living quietly as a retired grandfather. Neighbors described him as odd but harmless. No one suspected the man living among them had been one of California's most prolific criminals. The arrest sent shockwaves through law enforcement nationwide. For the first time, genetic genealogy had been used to solve a violent crime. Within months, police departments across the country began re-examining their coldest cases. If DNA evidence existed, there was now a pathway to identification, even without a traditional database match. In court, the DNA evidence was irrefutable. Forensic experts testified about the probability calculations, the genetic markers, the statistical impossibility of error. DeAngelo's defense couldn't challenge the science. It was too solid, too precise, too undeniable. In June 2020, Joseph DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of murder and dozens of other crimes. He received 11 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. The sentencing hearing lasted 3 days as victims and family members finally confronted him. Many said they never thought they'd see this day. Paul Holes, the investigator who'd pursued the case for decades, spoke at the sentencing. He described the weight that lifted when DeAngelo was identified. He thanked Barbara Rae-Venter and the genealogists who'd made it possible. And he acknowledged something profound. The families of other cold case victims were now watching, hoping, believing justice might still be possible. The Golden State Killer case demonstrated something remarkable about forensic science. Evidence doesn't expire. DNA preserved from 1976 was just as valid in 2018. And as technology advances, old evidence gains new power. What was unreadable becomes readable. What was untraceable becomes traceable. Since DeAngelo's arrest, genetic genealogy has solved over 300 cold cases. Murders from the 1960s and 70s are being solved today. Families who buried loved ones decades ago are finally getting answers. Each case proves the same principle. Science doesn't forget, and justice, however delayed, becomes possible through persistence and innovation. The technique has evolved rapidly. Genealogists now work with smaller DNA samples, more distant relatives, and incomplete family trees. Software tools automate parts of the tree-building process. What took weeks in 2018 now takes days. The science is becoming faster, more refined, more powerful with each case. Law enforcement agencies have established specialized genetic genealogy units. Genealogists now work alongside forensic scientists and detectives. It's become a standard tool in the investigative toolkit, as common as fingerprint analysis or ballistics testing. The marriage of genealogy and forensics has created an entirely new discipline. The Golden State Killer case changed what we believe is possible. Cases that were once considered unsolvable now hold promise. Every DNA sample in evidence storage represents potential justice waiting for science to catch up. And for families who've waited decades for answers, genetic genealogy offers something precious: hope. Joseph DeAngelo thought he was invisible. For 40 years, he was right. But he didn't account for the millions of people who would innocently upload their DNA to family history websites. He didn't anticipate that science would evolve to connect those genetic dots across generations. In the end, it wasn't a detective who caught the Golden State Killer. It was family trees, probability calculations, and the relentless march of forensic innovation. Science remembered what he hoped the world would forget: